The man they called Barrow was dying in the snow, and the only person who could stop it was a signals technician who had never fired a rifle at anything that shot back. That is where this story begins. Not at the briefing, not at the border crossing 3 days earlier, not at the training base in Petawawa, where Corporal Téa Vallen had spent 4 years running cable and calibrating frequency banks, while other soldiers earned their combat qualifications. It begins at the moment a Taliban-affiliated commander stepped over Warrant Officer Barrow's body, reached down, and picked up the satellite designator that Barrow had been protecting with his life. The commander looked at it the way a man looks at something he does not understand but knows is valuable. Then he looked up at the ridgeline, where 7 Canadian soldiers were pinned behind a collapsed mud wall, and he smiled. He should not have smiled. He could not have known, at that moment, that 31 meters up the slope behind him, wedged into a crack in the limestone, where the wind came through at 22 km/h from the northwest, a woman who had spent most of her military career being told she was in the wrong room was pressing her cheek against the stock of a rifle she had picked up off the ground 40 seconds ago. He should not have smiled. Téa Vallen had joined the Canadian Forces at 22 because she was good at mathematics and bad at pretending. She found other things more interesting. She had a degree from Dalhousie, applied mathematics, minor in physics, and she had sat across from a recruiting officer in Halifax on a Tuesday afternoon in November and told him she wanted to do something that mattered. The officer had looked at her test scores and her transcript and sent her to Signals. She did not complain. Signals mattered. Communications infrastructure was the nervous system of any modern operation, and Vallen understood nervous systems. She was good at her work in the precise, unsentimental way that people are good at things they have spent years doing without anyone particularly noticing. She could triangulate a signal source in adverse conditions faster than anyone in her unit. She could calculate propagation delays in her head. She understood, in a way most people in her trade did not bother to understand, the physics underneath the mathematics, why radio waves behaved the way they did, how terrain affected transmission, how temperature and humidity bent frequency bands in ways that required compensation. What she had never done in 4 years with the 76th Canadian Signals Regiment was fire at a human being. She had qualified on the C7, the standard issue rifle, because everyone qualifies on the C7. She had put rounds through paper targets at the range in Petawawa and received satisfactory marks on her evaluation, which meant she had hit what she aimed at consistently enough that no one had concerns. Satisfactory was not excellent. Satisfactory was sufficient. She had never thought much about the distinction. The distinction had become relevant in Afghanistan at 14 minutes past 2 in the morning when Barrow went down. The mission had been, on paper, a signals intelligence collection task. Vallen's unit had been asked to support a JTF2 team, Joint Task Force 2, Canada's Tier 1 Special Operations Unit, by establishing a communications relay on high ground east of the valley. The JTF2 team would move on a compound below, while Vallen's 4-person signals detachment held the relay point and maintained contact with the forward operating base. It was not supposed to be a combat task. Vallen had been on 3 previous deployments and had been in the proximity of combat twice, meaning she had heard gunfire from a distance and understood, intellectually, what was happening. She had never been in a firefight. Her weapon had never come off safe during a deployment. The man who changed that was Warrant Officer Douglas Barrow, and he changed it not through any failure of his own, but because the intelligence picture had been wrong, in ways that no one had caught before the helicopters lifted off from Kandahar. There were more fighters in the valley than the briefing had indicated, possibly 3 times more. The JTF2 team moved on the compound and encountered resistance immediately, heavier than expected. Within 4 minutes of the first shots, the team was taking casualties. Within 6 minutes, 2 operators were down, 1 dead, 1 critically wounded. The remaining operators pulled back toward the high ground where Vallen's detachment held the relay point because there was nowhere else to go. Barrow, who was the senior JTF2 operator still mobile, was trying to establish a medevac request on his own radio when the relay went down. Equipment failure, a matter of electronics and bad luck. and the particular vibration frequency of the explosion that had happened 30 meters from their position. Vallen was already moving to fix it when Barrow handed her the satellite designator and said, in a voice that was steady in the specific way that trained people are steady when they are not at all calm inside, "Keep this on you. Do not lose this." He was struck 11 seconds later. The round came from below, from a position that had not been identified, from a shooter who had worked his way up a dry creek bed that the aerial imagery had categorized as impassable. The round caught Barrow in the upper left chest, below the plate carrier's coverage, in the gap that exists in every piece of body armor ever designed, because human beings need to be able to move their arms. He went down hard. He did not get back up. Vallen heard the shot. She felt the pressure change in the air, the way you feel a door slam in another room. She turned and saw Barrow on the ground and understood, in the next 2 seconds, exactly what the situation required. The situation required someone to provide covering fire so that the remaining operators, 5 of them, plus her own 2 detachment members, could consolidate, treat Barrow, and establish a defensible position until the quick reaction force could reach them. There was one rifle on the ground near Barrow, his C8 carbine, which had skidded when he fell. There was no one in a position to pick it up except Téa Vallen. She did not hesitate in the way that gets described in stories as heroism. She did not make a decision exactly. She reached for the rifle the way you reach for something you have dropped, which is to say without deliberating, because deliberating takes time, and time was the one thing the situation was not offering. She picked it up. She moved to the limestone crack she had noticed when they first established the position, because it was the best natural cover on the slope, and because she had looked at the terrain the way she looked at everything, as a problem with a geometry to it. She pressed in and looked down. What she saw below her was chaos in the specific way that night combat is chaos. Shapes, moving, muzzle flashes from multiple points. The relay point burning at the edge of her field of view, the remaining JTF2 operators using a collapsed wall as cover and firing at targets she couldn't fully identify. And in the center of it, the commander with the satellite designator, standing in a way that told her he believed he was not in anyone's sights, standing with the confidence of a man who had just watched a warrant officer go down and believed the threat on the high ground had been neutralized. Vallen looked at the distance. She estimated 340 meters. She felt the wind on her left cheek coming from the northwest. She did not have a scope. The C8 had iron sights, which are designed for close quarters work, not for 340-meter shots in the dark. Later, when people asked her how she had done it, she would tell them the truth, which was that she had done the mathematics. Not consciously, not with a calculator. The mathematics lived in her, the way language lives in people who have spoken it since childhood. Not as a sequence of steps, but as a kind of grammar, a way of understanding what the world was doing and what she needed to do in response to it. She knew the ballistic coefficient of the standard 5.56 round. She knew the approximate wind deflection for that range and that speed. She knew the drop at that distance without the magnification to compensate for it. She knew she was shooting downhill, which changes the effective range calculation in ways that most shooters who have not studied the physics do not account for. She accounted for it. She aimed where the round needed to go, not where the target was. She slowed her breathing. She had been told at the range in Petawawa that breath control was the most important variable in accuracy over distance. She had filed this away as a fact, the way she filed away facts, without at the time understanding that she would ever need it to mean something. It meant something now. She exhaled halfway. She held it. She let the front sight post settle where she had calculated it needed to be. The man below her was still smiling when she pressed the trigger. It is worth understanding at this point what 340 meters looks like through iron sights at night. It looks like very little. The target is small. The sights are imprecise. The variables, wind, drop, angle, the shooter's own heartbeat, multiply against each other in ways that experienced long-range shooters spend years learning to compensate for. Most soldiers, given those conditions, would not take that shot. Most soldiers would not believe it was possible. Vallen did not consider whether it was possible. She considered where the round needed to be, calculated what she needed to do to put it there. and did it. She fired once. The man below went down. There was a pause. Not a long one, perhaps 2 seconds, in which the people on both sides of the firefight processed what had just happened. A shot, at night, at that distance, through iron sights, from a position that none of the fighters below had identified. The pause was the sound of a situation recalibrating. Then the firing resumed, but differently. The organized advance had broken. The fighters below were no longer moving toward the wall where the JTF2 operators were sheltering. They were moving laterally, trying to identify where the shot had come from, which meant they were moving away from the operators. Master Sergeant Reeve, the senior JTF2 operator, still on his feet, a man who had been on 22 operations in environments like this one and had, on 6 previous occasions, had his life depend on the skill of someone else, pushed himself up from behind the wall, grabbed Barrow by the drag handle on his plate carrier, and started moving him toward a more defensible position. He was shouting into his radio. He had reached the base. Vallen kept firing. Not at the commander, he was down. She fired at the muzzle flashes she could identify, at the shapes moving in the wrong direction, at anything that came within what she calculated was a reasonable probability of a hit. She did not fire wildly. She did not fire quickly. She fired with the patience of someone who understood that ammunition was finite and time was not. She fired 9 rounds in 3 minutes and 40 seconds. Afterwards, in the accounting that happens after every operation, they would confirm 3 hits. One of them had prevented a flanking movement that, if it had succeeded, would have exposed the position where the wounded JTF2 operator was being treated. The operator's name was Corporal Téa. She was 26 years old. She would recover. The quick reaction force arrived 17 minutes after Vallen fired her first shot. By then the fight was effectively over. Not won, exactly, but transformed from an ambush into a standoff, and standoffs end differently than ambushes. Barrow was medivist. He would survive. It would take 4 surgeries in 11 months, but he would survive. Reeve found Vallen after the QRF had established a perimeter, when the immediate threat had been reduced to a matter of searching and accounting, and the particular exhausted silence that follows violence. She was sitting against the limestone, the C8 across her knees, looking at nothing in particular. The satellite designator was still in her vest pocket. She had kept it on her, as Barrow had asked. She had not lost it. Reeve sat down next to her. He did not say anything for a moment. He looked out at the valley below, where the QRF was moving through the compound with lights now, because the need for darkness was over. Then he said, "What's your trade?" She told him. "Signals technician, 76th Regiment." He was quiet for another moment. "You have a math background?" he asked. "Applied math," she said. "Dalhousie." He nodded as if this confirmed something he had already worked out. "In 22 operations," he said, "I have had a situation where someone else's specific skill was the thing keeping me and my people alive exactly 7 times. He paused. He looked at her. Tonight was number 7. She did not know what to say to that. She had been raised in Truro, Nova Scotia, in a house where understatement was the primary emotional language, and she recognized understatement when she heard it. She understood that he was telling her something significant and that he was telling it to her the only way he knew how to tell it. "You're going to know what you did tonight for a long time," he said. "You're going to carry it. That's not a small thing." He picked up a pebble from the ground next to him, looked at it and set it down again. "But you also need to understand that Osi is alive. Barrow has a chance. The 2 people I'm taking home, who I wasn't sure I was going to take home 2 hours ago, that's because of what you did on this slope." He stood up. He looked down at her with the particular expression of a man who has spent a career measuring people against the worst conditions he can imagine and has rarely been surprised. "There are people who train for years and can't do what you did tonight," he said. "I don't know what to do with that yet, but I know it's true." He walked back toward the perimeter. Vallen sat in the dark for a few minutes longer. The wind had picked up. It was coming from the north now, colder, and it moved through the crack in the limestone with a sound that was almost musical. She thought about Barrow. She thought about the mathematics, the drop, the drift, the angle, the half-breath she had held before the trigger broke. She thought about the man who had smiled. She thought about what Reeve had said. "You're going to carry it." She understood that he was right. She also understood that carrying something and being destroyed by it were different things, and that the distinction between those two outcomes was a matter of what you did with the weight once you had it. She had been a signals technician. She would go back to being a signals technician. She would run cable and calibrate frequency banks and triangulate signal sources in adverse conditions. She would do that work, and she would do it well, because that was her job, and she was good at her job. But she had also been, for 3 minutes and 40 seconds, on a limestone slope in a valley whose name she would never say out loud, in a casual conversation, the thing that stood between 7 people and the dark. That was not a credential. It was not a qualification. There was no form in any military database that would capture it accurately. It was simply a fact about her. The way the mathematics was a fact about her, the way the wind direction was a fact about the night. She picked up the C8. She checked the chamber. Old habit, the range instructor's voice in her memory, always checked the chamber, Vallen, every time, and made it safe. She stood up. The QRF was finishing its sweep. Someone was calling her name from the perimeter. She walked toward the voice. The notebook she kept. A small thing, green cover, the kind you could buy at any Canadian Tire for $2, had her signal logs in it. The frequencies she had been tracking, the propagation data for the valley, the numbers that had been her whole job that night before the job changed. On the last page, below the final frequency notation, she had written something in the dark. She did not remember writing it. She must have done it during the pause after the first shot, in the 2-second silence when the world was recalibrating and she was waiting to see what it recalibrated into. It said, wind NW22, drop 11.4, angle 8 degrees, adjust left 0.3 mil. The numbers that had put the round exactly where it needed to be. She looked at the page for a moment. Then she closed the notebook and put it back in her pocket, next to the satellite designator that Barrow had asked her not to lose. She had not lost it. She was not going to lose any of it.